to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-hosts Rick Lee and David Gunkel, and today our very special guest, Nir Kedem. Today we're talking about overcoming sexuality. But before we get to that, we want to get everybody's drink orders and see what you're ranting or raving about this week. So, David, let me go to you first. What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
Yes, so since it is a sweltering day here in Chicago, I'm going to go with the Weiss beer from Dovetail. So, Dovetail, give us a call. And I am going to be raving about the Los Angeles punk band X. So, X has been around since at least 1977 and been active the entire time. They are on their farewell tour this year. At least that's what it's being called. And I saw them at Fitzgerald's on Sunday on a very sweltering afternoon. But these people are well into their 70s and still really putting forward a very aggressive and very interesting performance. It was really nice to be able to go there with my kid, who's a second-generation Xer, and this may be the last time we have a chance to see them. But if you've not heard X, check them out. They're pretty decent Americana-type punk and one of the longest-running punk bands out of the LA scene.
Can you do punk in the afternoon? It seems very unpunk.
Oh, yeah, no. When you're 70, you got to get it done so you can get to bed by 8 o'clock.
You need to catch the early bird special.
That you do.
Rick, what about you?
So since I am, as we record this, sitting in Krakow, Poland, and I am a half a block away from the old Okocim brewery, I'm going to have an Okocim. And I am ranting today about the amount of electricity AI is consuming. I just recently read an article that individually both Microsoft and Google are consuming more electricity than 100 countries around the world. And together, they're consuming more electricity than way more than 100 countries around the world. I really think this is unsustainable. And I also think that the idea that people like Sam Altman have, namely fusion, is not just right around the corner. So somehow we need to get a handle on this, as well as the water consumption to cool these really hot machines.
Can I just add that these estimates are from researchers because we have no federal guidelines for even reporting this data. So we can't even track it very well just yet.
Right. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nir Kedem. Nir is an assistant professor of cultural studies in the Department of Cultural Studies, Creation and Production at Sapir Academic College, and he also lectures at the Tisch School of Film and Television at Tel Aviv University. What brings him here today, and this goes hand in hand with our recent partnership with Edinburgh University Press, is his recent book called A Deleuzian Critique of Queer Thought, Overcoming Sexuality. Nir writes and does research on queer theory, feminist theory, gender studies, as well as philosophers like Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault. And so we're very happy to have Nir with us. Nir, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
First of all, thank you for inviting me and having me here. As I said, maybe 3 times already. I'm a little nervous. So I think what will help me is a bourbon smash.
I like the way you say that. What will help me?
I'm a whiskey bourbon person, and it's not a summer drink. And the smash, like a bourbon smash, like a summery version of it. And I want to rave about the 16th International Deleuze and Guattari Studies Conference that took place last week in the Netherlands. For Deleuzians, if we can be called like that, not everybody likes this kind of name. Deleuze was a philosopher, but he was working in so many disciplines, from linguistics to politics to geography, education, and you can see it in all the Deleuze research. And the conference, it's a conference and a camp. Actually, there's the Deleuze camp. I went to the first one in 2009. It was in Cologne in Germany. Basically, every year, a different university hosts the conference with a theme. It's so great to meet all those people that are my actual community, my actual academic community, the people with whom I can talk and we don't have to explain each other a lot of things like I always need to do with everyone else, because Deleuze is very challenging. It's been challenging for me. Yeah, so this is what I'm raving about. I was there and it was wonderful. And I'm so happy that we have that conference and camp.
Well, I hope you're up for doing a lot of explaining here today.
It's okay. I'm used to that. I think every Deleuzean is used to that.
Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Well, I think what would help me is also a bourbon. So I will have 2 fingers of Benchmark and a rock. And today I am raving about Jacques Derrida's book, Rogues, 2 Essays on Reason. Derrida wrote this back in 2002, so immediately after 9/11, and part of the theme of the book is addressing what were, at that time, unprecedented times. And now that we live in only unprecedented times, I mean, does anybody miss precedented times? I feel like it's a book that's worth revisiting. There's a lot in there about the state of exception, about democracy's aporia, and I think given what's going on in the world today, and especially in the United States today, it's worth revisiting Derrida's Rogues. I'll just mention my favorite quote from that text, which is that the great problem facing modern representative and parliamentary democracies is that the alternative to democracy can always be represented as a democratic alternative. I think that is unfortunately what we're facing in this upcoming election. So we're really glad to have Nir here. And Rick, this was your idea to invite Nir to talk about this book, Deleuze and Overcoming Sexuality. So how did you want to set up this conversation?
Toward the end of the 20th century, the French philosopher Michel Foucault called into question all the ways in which a variety of practices, ways we relate to each other, institutions, and discourse came to be organized all under this concept, sexuality. So the construction of sexuality as a thing, as a category, as a concept that seemingly identifies something crucial about us, operates as a way to make certain individuals, certain practices and relations visible. Visible to science, visible to institutions, juridically visible, and politically visible. There is, on the other hand, a great danger with this visibility because it brings into the open and identifies individuals so that they can become subject to regimes of power. Queer theory and queerness itself seems like it's inextricably tied to this notion of sexuality. How can someone or something be queer if we give up on this concept of sexuality? But on the other hand, the very notion of sexuality sexualizes everything it touches and thereby reduces the possibilities of queerness itself. How can we think queer without sexuality? Why should we think queer without sexuality? What possibilities are opened by queer thought once it is no longer bound to the image of sexuality? Nir, I think the first question we need to start with is your book, like Michel Foucault's work, engages in a critique of sexuality. So maybe you should tell us what's wrong with sexuality.
Well, the answer depends on what do you mean when you say sexuality. It's not a way to avoid the question. On the contrary, any introduction to queer theory that you will read, whether it's a book or a textbook or even just introductory notions, they will all mention at some point that Foucault is like the father of queer theory, that everything came from him, etc. But if we talk about that, sexuality for Foucault is a dispositif. This is the French word. It's difficult to translate. It was translated as apparatus, device, deployment, All of them are not exactly true. What's interesting is that Agamben, in his little book about apparatus, what is an apparatus, he actually explains that. So I usually just use dispositif, which is the word in French. And dispositif is simply a collection of strategies to control something or someone. It is tied, of course, to Foucault's concept of power. So in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, I think it's the only place that Foucault actually have a little chapter about his theory of power, if you can call it that. He didn't want to call it that. He called it analytics of power. It is a very condensed and very unreadable chapter. Something I actually had to work a lot when I explain it to students. And it is there that he presents this very general term, power, and what he means by it. And I think the most important thing about the term that Foucault calls power is relation. Power is always relation. Power is not a thing, but it exists between people, between individuals, between groups. Actually, in interviews and essays, like standalone essays, he was more clear about it, but he was consistent.
Yeah.
Power is just a way that someone is trying to affect the behavior of someone else. So saying, excuse me, in the street, when I walk on the street and I see someone, for Foucault, this is exercising power because I'm trying to change their behavior. Now, what he calls sexuality is basically a collection of strategies to control both individuals and the population, not in the sense of some conspiracy theory or something like that, because that is not. Sometimes that is the first thing that they try to figure out. Who are those people, like in Marx's notion of capitalist, right? The bourgeoisie who hold all the money. So it's not that, because we know that Foucault said that power is very impersonal. Sexuality is basically that. It's the combination of strategies to control both individuals and population. And it's only when he gets to the last chapter of Volume 1 that we understand it more. It makes sense more because this is the chapter where he describes the modern form of power, which he calls biopower. And biopower, it's like this thing with two arms. On the one arm, it uses discipline, as he discussed it in Discipline and Punish, as a power to basically produce what he calls docile bodies to shape their behaviors on the level of the individuals. But what biopower also means is this other arms that he calls biopolitics. And this arm, what it tries to do is regulate the population. And it does it in a way that treats it like an organism. This is when statistics are born and concepts of public health and what is good and what is bad to the public's health, right? So biopower needs both things. And within it, at the very, if you can call it middle, there's sex as the most constructed illusionary term for him. Sexuality is at the center of it because sexuality is what both creates people, the reproduction. So we need it to take care of the population. But it's also what can at least potentially bring disease, right? In the 19th century, there was this big problem with syphilis. That's why sexuality matters so much. And that is what's wrong with it. It shapes us while making itself very invisible. It needs us to be visible, both as a collective, both as community and as individuals. Basically, that's the main problem with sexuality. It makes us visible to power. Power can control or change or affect us more efficiently when we are sexualized. When I saw Foucault's interview in this paper, I think it was translated as The Gay Science, and I opened my introduction with it. He says, we're not only supposed to or need to liberate our sexuality, we need to liberate ourselves from sexuality. And that is something that queer theory, I think, missed in a way. But other than that, nothing's wrong with sexuality. If you just use it to say sexual identity, fine. That's not the problem.
I'm glad you added that last part because I do want to give you a chance to make clear that you're not saying what we should do is just get rid of this category or just get rid of this concept, even as an identifier. I know that in race theory, a lot of people will say, well, race is a constructed concept. We can trace its historical roots. It has no tie to biology. And one criticism of what we now call post-racialists was they were saying, well, we should just stop using it. Talking about race is like talking about Santa Claus. If we just stop using it, then all the problems associated with it will go away. And it seems very clear from your text that that's obviously not what you're arguing. Sexuality as a dispositif, the power exercises, assemblages, operations are going to go on whether we say the word or not. So I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of make that distinction for our listeners about what you actually mean by overcoming or liberating oneself from sexuality.
Thank you for that. The example that you gave about race and this talk about, okay, so we just stop using that word and then it disappears. Something similar was said when Judith Butler just started talking about gender, as if it's just a choice. Oh, so it's a construct, so let's throw it away and we're free.
Right.
But if we go back to Foucault, the fact that it's a construction doesn't mean that it's not real. Mm-hmm. It shapes people's life. People understand themselves and other people understand them and others through that very thing. So we can deny it. We can say, okay, let's stop saying it. But stop saying it, it's just, then we become language police, right? Which term to use, which term is allowed. But it doesn't start and end with just the word. When I talk about overcoming sexuality, I take my cue from Foucault, from this very challenge. Because when I started with queer theory in my BA, there were not even courses at the university about queer theory or anything. I just started learning about it. And it was a promise. It was a promise not just to change the way we think about sexuality, but revolutionize the way we think. And I loved it and I believed it and I still do. This is not a book, I also say it in the introduction, right? That this is not a book that is meant to critique and just say, let's throw queer theory to the garbage of history. We're done with it. Definitely not. I just want to hold it to its promise. And one of the things to do is to understand how sexuality, it's something that very quickly, apparently, because I'm citing even those that are considered like the founding figures of queer theory, okay? David Halperin, Judith Butler, Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and other, Leo Bersani, which became, after the year 2000, inspirational to a whole change, a whole shift in queer theory called the antisocial thesis. He was the first to say, what are you talking about? He has this chapter in his book, Homos. The chapter is called The Gay Absence, to say gays actually delete themselves as they do all these kind of things with queer theory. So what I wanted to see is, what can we do beyond sexuality? What is queer theory without sexuality? Because it always starts with those definitions, those apologetic definitions. Queer is indeterminacy. It relates to its sense as the strange, the unknowable, the unknown, the unfamiliar, whatever. But on the other hand, it was, as we all know, a term used derogatively, first of all, for gay men, mainly for gay men, this slur. And it's tied to the sense of sexuality. Okay, so queer theory beyond semantics was constantly trying to preserve this tension between these two senses, the promise of the strange and the unknown, and on the other hand, what it does to sexuality. Now, the more I researched and the more I learned, what I saw is that sexuality took over indeterminacy, the sense of queer as indeterminate. Basically, what we know now is that queer is a sexual identity. This is how it's used today by many people. And what it refers to is a sort of indeterminacy of that sexuality or sexuality in general. This is not what is indeterminate about queer. So basically what the book is most concerned with is the first decade of queer theory, its moment of birth, if we can call it that way, the moment when queer stopped meaning just another slur. It became a concept. It became something that was used. And it was used, first of all, by AIDS activists. And then in 1990, queer theory was sort of founded when I think it was Teresa de Lauretis organized that conference that later became the first special issue of Differences, the journal that was called Queer Theory, which basically announced in a way that this new, maybe not discipline, but this new way of thinking that it offers us, and it starts with sexuality. Sexuality is part of the contingency of queer as a concept and of queerness maybe in general, and definitely queer theory. It's not something that we can dismiss. And it's not something that we should dismiss, because we need to see the specificity of it. There are places in the world where this is still a problem. You can think of the States and you can think of Western Europe. It's not like, oh, we're done with that. Everything's fine. Everyone can be, whatever they want. No. These struggles are real and they are important, but they are, in a way, impediment to queer theory, to queer thought. This is what I mean by overcoming sexuality. To overcome this thought that we have to work to affirm sexuality again and again, find it and refine it anywhere and everywhere. Every time people start to talk about queer and explain it, they start with this sense of indeterminacy. But do we not know what queer means? Of course we know what queer means. There's nothing indeterminate about that anymore. Because you see it again and again. Do you know what queering is? Yes, you know what queering is. If you take all those introductions to queer theory, like textbooks that are important, it's part of the problem. It's just being an introduction. You try to explain a very complex concept, but basically, queering, it's deconstructing again and again and again in all kinds of disciplines and areas. This is what I want to overcome. Sex is great. Sexuality is great. We cannot get rid of it, just like we can get rid of race and class and gender and all other things that comprise our identity.
Nir, I want to go back to a point you made about the notion of power as being a relation, and think about sexuality not in terms of, let's say, political institutions, courts, legislatures, and so on, but in the way in which we relate to one another. Because I'm wondering if there isn't a liberation in the ways in which we relate to one another if we liberate ourselves from sexuality. I could put this in a more blunt way, namely that there would be a million ways we could organize practices of pleasure even around sexuality, and yet that we focus primarily on genitalia seems a little bit odd. And it seems as if there might be a way to liberate even practices of pleasure if we were liberated from sexuality.
Yeah, that's what Foucault was also talking about. That's why he used and liked the concept of pleasure, because it was a little under-theorized. Pleasure as desexualizing. Why is it desexualizing? Exactly because what you said. It's a moment that you experience pleasure that we call sexual pleasure, but you experience pleasure in organs of the body that are not the genitalia. Pleasure helps us in a way undermine our sexual identity that was set to us by desire. He uses this opposition because desire makes us into subjects, while pleasure is a desubjectivizing, I think that's how it was translated, practice. But he wasn't prescriptive about it. He didn't say this is the only way to do it. In fact, what I liked about what he said, and I think it's very close to what you said, Rick, about how we relate to one another. Foucault said the real threat was not gay sex itself. It's what we do with our sexuality. That's what was threatening. And what people did with sexuality, and I am talking about gay, lesbian, trans, they are creating communities. They are creating new ways of bonding to each other. Foucault then said, let's rethink friendship. Friendship as a way of life, right? That was one of his last things that he thought about. That was something that maybe started with sexuality, but then it left it behind to move and do something else. In a sense, I'm just saying that I think you're spot on. It's not only that we cannot be without our sexuality in the term I used before. It's not like I can stop using it and it's going to change or disappear as a problem. It's not. But it can be something to leave behind as I am looking for new ways to relate to people. He had this very weird, beautiful example of adoption between an older guy and a younger guy. So it's not an equal relationship. It's not a relationship between equals, but the equality is not a thing. It's not a problem. It was one of the ways to rethink relationships.
If I could just briefly ask you a question on behalf of Gen Z. I am, of course, not Gen Z, but I do think that one of the things that we see in millennials and Gen Z is that the self-identification as queer is often not understood as identification of one's sexuality, but is more in relation to gender. Obviously, at the heart of these two arms of power, as you described it, sex is there, and sexuality and gender are both tied to that concept of sex. But I'm wondering if you could just briefly say whether or not you think that the emergence of queerness as an identity, not in reference to one's sexuality, but in reference to upsetting, for example, gender binaries, is a way of making good on this promise that you're looking for.
Yes and no, because I use in the book to reconstruct the concept of queer, not just Foucault's work, but mainly David Halperin's work. When he talks about what is queer, when he finally gets to the way to define queer, and it's maybe one of the most cited definitions ever as an anti-identity, what he is saying that queer is like an empty position within power relations, that the potential within it is to create new identities.
Right.
So yes, definitely, it's part of it. But if we look at it today, as people use queer today, as a concept to say about themselves, either I'm non-binary or whatever. So how is it different and how is it better than the concept of transgender or trans asterisk, which basically it's doing the same gesture of trying to be inclusive, and yet it has its own discourse and it has its own potentiality, which is not very different, maybe even better. Maybe today transgender studies do queer in the sense of what we talked about queer before it became an identity better than anything.
Yeah.
So can I ask you, just since we're in this introductory phase, and this might be a good way to explain one more tension that I think people may be perceiving in this conversation. So you said previously that sexuality is the way in which we are subjected to and made a subject of power. That's an important Foucauldian point. But in the sort of popular discourse of sexuality, the declaration of your sexuality is also seen as self-empowering. It is a way of subjecting yourself to a kind of power that you take control of. And I can see a tension in different ways in which power functions in those two discourses. And I'm wondering if you can just spell it out for us and work that tension through.
For me, Foucault did all that work already when he talked about confession. Confession is a device, a very important device for power in relation to sexuality, because it demands us to tell ourselves and the world and others who we are and what we are through our sexuality. And this is the moment that has this both potential and a dangerous illusion to it. Because as you said, when I come out, queer theory, gay and lesbian studies had this whole work about coming out of the closet. At a certain point, it was perceived as self-empowering. I'm taking control over. But in Foucauldian terms, you are simply binding yourself even better to power because you're now visible to it. That's the problem. Foucault is saying, well, we keep telling ourselves this story. We, the Western society, Western Europe, maybe even just Catholic French, but I do see it like in general, just the West, okay, that he talks about. He says, why do we keep telling ourselves that story about how sexuality was once relatively free in a way that it was not that important. It didn't have that place it has today. And then ever since the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, sexuality has been going through this oppression, becomes more and more oppressed by power. The Victorian times, the Victorian period, the 19th century, is the epitome of the oppression of sexuality. So he says, why are we telling ourselves this story? And what are we doing when we tell ourselves as a society this story? Because ever since then, we keep fighting to free our sexuality from power. And we take such moments of confession either to the world, which, sure, again, it's effective. There are places in the world where getting out of the closet is important and a political act that has a lot of consequences that we used to see in the West. It is still important, but it is seen as the secret of who you are, of who we are. Then we feel empowered when we confess and we say, this is who I am. This is what I am. As you said, it gives me control over my own narrative and myself. But then Foucault was just saying, this is another way that power got a grip on us. Another way. And this he's saying without trying to dismiss the hard work that was done and still being done, I would say even today in the West, by all those struggles of the gay liberation movements, the homophile movements before. So it's kind of this double bind sexuality.
Clinky glasses and challenging ideas is kind of our thing here at Hotel Bar Sessions, but both the drinks and the server space cost money. You can help keep this podcast independent and ad-free by signing up to be a Hotel Bar Sessions patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. For less than the cost of a mild night of drinking per month, you'll be helping to defray the many costs of our podcast and saving us from having to start our own cult. If you'd prefer to make a one-time donation or several of them, just visit our website at hotelbarpodcast.com, where you can find links to support this podcast through Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App. As always, we appreciate your listening, and especially your helping us to keep pouring wisdom one conversation at a time.
Near part of the title of your book includes a critique of queer theory, and I'm sure many people just reading that phrase make assumptions about what you're doing and misunderstand what you mean by critique. If I think about the history of the use of the term critique in philosophy, it doesn't simply mean saying this is wrong or this is bad or negating it, but rather pointing out that there might be limitations. Am I correct in understanding your argument that you see that as long as queer theory is tied to sexuality, there are going to be certain limitations? And if so, then I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what some of those limitations might be that are exposed by means of a critique.
Yeah, the title is a Deleuzian critique. It's an operational concept of critique that I use in this book to designate how I employ Deleuze's work to critique queer theory. Now, you are absolutely right that this is not about just fault finding. This is bad, this doesn't work, this is not true, this is not critique. This is criticism. Mm-hmm. So there's criticism in the sense of, like, we criticize a film or a book or a work of art for being good or bad. And it's good or bad according to the criteria, we can even say subjective criteria of the critic. For example, if I would read a review and the critic would say, well, this movie is horrible because it's completely unrealistic and that's why it's bad, basically. This is not critique. This is criticism. Critique, on the other hand, would ask why realism is something that can make a film good or bad. How did we come to that?
Right.
So critique, in the sense that I use it and in the sense it operates for Deleuze, is first of all from critical philosophy that we know from Kant. Deleuze is a post-Kantian. As I said, he was in many disciplines, but he was trained as a philosopher.
Right.
So he's a philosopher first and foremost. And there are Deleuzians that I admire the work that work on his philosophy in terms of the hardcore philosophy. So they are explaining how it was important to him. And they are reading Difference in Repetition, as well as What is Philosophy, which are two different books, like a reconstruction, all the three Kantian critiques. But when I started to work on this, it's a problem that anyone working with Deleuze is encountering. And the problem is, how do I use it? How do I use his work? I don't want it to be just something that I apply. Oh, here I take a theory and then I apply it to something else. It's like this, it's like that. When you read Deleuze enough, you understand, or you start feeling like you betray that kind of philosophy. And that drove me crazy. For many, many years, I was trying to figure out how am I going to work with him. First of all, I learned a lot about his concept of critique and how it was related to post-Kantian philosophy. The main important thing was the demand for a genetic account. And that was a problem for all post-Kantians. Like, he was talking about the faculties and he assumed their accord or the way that they work together, but he didn't give an account of how they are created. And that is the demand for a genetic account. That's what's always missing. I'm oversimplifying it, but just to get the point through. And then you read Deleuze scholars, and they all talk about how to work with Deleuze this way or another. And any introduction, any what we would call an introductory book, like a tertiary thoughts, sources, all of them, they're not just about explaining Deleuze. They have something to say about how to use it, how to use his work, how he uses his work. And then I wanted to go even further to say, like, I want to know really in practical terms, how do I use it? Okay. In the book, I take the model of constructivism that he presents. It's him and Guattari, but it's basically him in What is Philosophy? What it means to do philosophy. And I said, okay, let's take that. That is a system. That is a method. It's not a dirty word for Deleuzians. Sometimes it seems like, oh no, Deleuze is against method. The problem is that Deleuze works with systems. His concepts are part of systems. And part of the problem, and it's also an advantage, it's something that you can also use, is that you have to understand the concept within that system. So, for example, method could be, yes, a word that in general denotes something that is not doing philosophy or is bad with philosophy, but it would only appear that way in a certain place. But when he talks about, let's say, I think it was Bergson, method gets another sense, and a sense that is not automatically bad. It's not like, oh, this is not the way. So I wanted to find, and the more I read him, I found that, first of all, you have to understand the concept within that system. For me, it was a concept of queer and how it operated within this thing called queer theory. That's when I found all those kind of mock rules and guidelines in Deleuze's philosophy. He has this beautiful text, very short one, but he says, you want to work on that philosopher, you need to learn how to admire. What does that mean? How to admire? How do you admire? You try to trace back the problems of that philosopher. So the concept of critique, the operational concept that I work with, I basically said 3 moments. You can think of them not in a chronological order because they're always there, always present in any critical move. But in each and every one of them, I can give you like a mock rule. This is how I work with Deleuze to do that.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty with the Deleuzian critique, still I'm not quite clear on what is queer theory as long as it's operating with the notion of sexuality. What is it not able to see? What problems is it not able to uncover? Or what are its limitations that you saw that need to be aided by a critique of any kind and then maybe a Deleuzian critique?
What started as the problem for me was that queer theory basically announced itself as something new, something that is going to revolutionize or promise to revolutionize our thought. But then you just found out that it does again and again the same thing. So at first it had this big promise and it did important work that we couldn't have done without. But what did it miss? For example, queer theory became its own discourse, which was separated in a very artificial way from AIDS discourse. That was one of the first things that I learned. And if there's a problem with queer theory, with its sexualizing everything, is basically that it repeats itself. It repeats itself in the same gestures, as if you can just take that concept and take that theory and just plant it or use it wherever you want without changing a thing.
So then, far from being a negation or, as you put it, a criticism of queer theory, your critique actually sets out to, in a sense, save it or put it on a stronger footing.
Yeah. What the book basically shows that if you use that kind of critique to understand first what is queer theory's image of thought, which I will probably say something about in a minute. But what was amazing about the time that I was working on it is that I already realized what queer theory can do without or beyond sexuality because it already did. That is like the last part of the book. When we return to the genesis of queer, right, the genetic account. First of all, it wasn't born in academia. It started with the activism. It started with AIDS activism. Even for Queer Nation, this organization that came out of ACT UP, which was founded in New York in 1987, and it was all about AIDS activism because the old ways didn't work. The gay liberation ways that worked so great in 1969, basically, and after the Stonewall riots, they didn't work. People were dying like flies. And you cannot talk about queer theory just through the histories of sexuality and post-structuralism or whatever without understanding the actual conditions that set that problem in real life. In real life, there was nothing playful or postmodern. Some people use it in a negative way. It was a reaction to a very important need. And the need was to imagine life where living with AIDS is not a death sentence.
Right.
That it's a possibility. That's what those activists did. Of course, they had to go through sexuality. Sexuality, as I said, it was part of the contingency of queer theory, right? Part of the historical conditions that made it what it is and made queer a response to a problem. And the problem was AIDS. The problem was not identity or sexual identity. The problem was AIDS. And the problem was a whole way of life, a whole culture, a whole community was dying. And it sensed that people are doing nothing. It had this urgency. So yes, I knew already what queer theory can do because it already did. It did. It imagined, it had to imagine, it had to make thinkable life where AIDS is not a death sentence. And this is life, this is already happening today, right?
So one of the things I really like about the way that you draw out these three moments of Deleuzean critique, so the pragmatic, the problematic, and then the genetic, and draw it to that recognition of the necessity of the problem of responding to the AIDS crisis, the problematization of sexuality, and then genesis of queer as a concept in queer theory. What I like about that is that it goes back to the fact that the reason this was important in the first place was because it was a matter of life and death. It was a matter of making new ways of life possible, and that it promised something that now you're saying it closed off that promise at some point. And I wonder if, and this is not a criticism of your work, which I think is a really important work, but I wonder if now the problem that you're recognizing is a problem with queer theory. And that doesn't operate in the same register as, for example, the AIDS crisis. So one could say we need to liberate queer or queerness from sexuality because there are a lot of, for example, queer youth who are committing suicide, or queer youth who are homeless, or trans people who are being murdered, or legislation that's being passed that's anti-queer or anti-LGBTQI+. That's a problem. And I'm wondering why we wouldn't start there, or why you wouldn't start there instead of starting with the problem is basically academics who haven't made good on their promises.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. We are no longer queer in the sense that the problem changed. And it's not just a problem, it's problems. You described several. And I don't even know if queer or queer theory or queer activism, whatever that is the right answer to those. We don't have anything pre-given. We don't have pre-made solutions for that. So the point is, it wasn't trying to be just a criticism of a discourse, as you said, but actually reconnected to actual problems. Mm-hmm. That was the problem back then. What are the problems now? What is our problem? And if you read even in academic texts, or the very concrete examples that she gave, like suicide of queer youth, of transgender, the more important thing is not saving queer theory as it is finding the means, conceptual and non-conceptual, practical, to respond to these problems and to recognize them. Think about how weird it is that queer became an identity. It's indeterminate, it's always malleable, it's evasive, it's elusive. But then again, it become almost a universal thing, not just because we think about it as an identity, because the way it's used, and not just in discourse, like around the world. So that's why I wanted this return to the AIDS crisis. That's why I insisted that queer should be understood, first of all, as an American problem, because this is where it started. There was no necessity to this occasion other than it happened to happen there. that AIDS got to North America and what it did, retying the old notion of homosexuality with disease and so forth. And yes, that's why I want queer theory to take a step further. Like, okay, don't give up sexuality, but take it as a point of departure, not the end, not the beginning, not the foundation, something that you can go beyond to actually see real problems, real conditions of experience, also in the philosophical sense, and how we can solve them. This is a Deleuzian concept, a problem and a solution. He always says, kind of paraphrasing, but he says something like, the solution we get is the solution that we deserve according to the problem that we have posed. So the trick is to find the problem and to find true problems.
Yeah, and I think that taking sexuality as a point of departure for rethinking queer is a good start to the actual problems that I just mentioned. I mean, arguably, this is not even arguable, I don't think. We could say that much of the violence that is visited upon both people who identify as queer and people who are identified as queer today is done by a certain population on the political right who are, in fact, largely in control of the legislative process and who definitely are obsessed with sexuality, obsessed with abnormal sexuality or perverse sexuality or whatever. And so understand combating queerness as a way of combating basically social disease, as Foucault might say. So yeah, I think your project is a really good one. I just wanted to give you a chance to make clear that ultimately you're not just kind of cleaning house in the ivory tower here, that you really are concerned that this get back to actual problems.
Yes, and I think that when queer became a response, and it was born as a response to the AIDS crisis, it basically was a precursor to think about virality as a way of life, as a mode of existence, as something that is not entirely even human because of those conditions. So that it was just one path. I would never say that you cannot use queer in any context. It's just like any other theory, but theory is to be used. It's not just principles in the air. That was what Deleuze says. Deleuze and Foucault has this beautiful conversation. It's called Intellectuals and Power. They're talking about the changing role of the intellectual back then. I think it was 1972. And Deleuze says he's actually agreeing with Foucault, and he says theory is like a toolbox. Mm-hmm. If you can't use it, if there's no use to it, and not just for the theoretician, not just the one, as you say, in the ivory tower that uses, then either it's useless or its time hasn't come yet. So change it. Theory needs to work. That is what I call the pragmatic moment. The rule is connected to a project, connected to an actual problem now, which is outside philosophy and outside theory. This is where thought begins.
So you were just talking about theory as being a kind of toolkit. What I want to do to sort of conclude all this is let's open up the toolbox and get a few tools out and see what we can do with it. Mm-hmm. My question with regards to that is this. In philosophy, especially Western European philosophy, there is this talk consistently about overcoming. Martin Heidegger talks about the overcoming of metaphysics, the overcoming of a certain tradition. And in a way, you are beholden to that tradition in the way you talk about overcoming sexuality. And I'm just wondering, once we apply these tools and we work on overcoming sexuality, what does that leave? Like, what is the outcome? What is the result?
Yeah, well, like everything with Foucault and Deleuze, they're not prescriptive. And we cannot know in advance. The only way we will actually know is if we try to use it and think beyond it. I think that a lot of the work being done now, at least in the field of queer theory, is going in that way. They're trying to figure out new problems and new ways to relate to them. And it also has been happening for a while. So for me, the thing was, I could see that queer as a solution to the AIDS crisis. A solution in the terms, not that it solves it once and for all, because of course this doesn't happen, but it kind of replays the problem as it reacts to it. And it reacts to it because it has to rethink this mode of existence and this change, all the habits of thinking, all the manners of thinking, this is Deleuze again. There was that moment that our old patterns didn't work anymore. We didn't recognize what was in front of us until it was named AIDS. But that is the very first moment of thinking. So we need to, in a way, get to such a moment. We need to do the work ourselves and connect, maybe even just a notion of critique or whatever theory that we do. We need to connect it, as I said, to real problems. This is what was happening when you think beyond sexuality. This is what I call the pause, which did become an identity, like pauses in the HIV positive. It became an identity. It became a culture. People have created new ways of relating, like Rick said earlier, new ways of relating to other people.
Yeah.
So the point is really to try and go beyond those limits, to go to real thinking.
As a card-carrying Derridian, I'm super excited about that. I mean, I'm happy to see, as you said, the promise of queer recovered as not independent of sexuality, but certainly opening up more things and not being necessary that it has to always go back to sexuality. I suppose I will just still say, though, that in as much as we tie the concept queer to real problems, I'm not sure that we can at the same time overcome sexuality. I still think that it's the case that the real problems as they present themselves to us are about queer being very much tied to sexuality. So I'm not asking you to fix that problem. I'm just saying I see both the promise that you're laying out here and also the massive difficulty in making good on that promise, which may just be the history of queer theory, is that it's hard to make good on these promises, you know. Also true of deconstruction.
I mean, also, Lee, it seems to me that part of your point earlier was that it's not queer theorists who are producing this sexualization of queerness. It's legislatures, it's pastors, it's police. And in the face of the demand, in the face of authority, that one have an identity, tell me your identity, tell me all about your identity, we're in a very difficult situation, I think.
I agree with you, and I think that's a good point, but it's also not queer theorists that are doing this.
In what you said, Lee, you're basically saying, and it's very true, the work is not done. We're not done with it.
Right.
And it's true of feminism and it's true of critical race theory because we still have those problems. But the problems are changing and they receive different expressions where they are. So AIDS maybe is not a problem for the West, but it is a problem in other parts of the world. And queer or queer theory is maybe not the right way to respond to that, right? To me, the only thing that is, David, coming back to your overcoming, it's the same over of the overman of Nietzsche in the sense of, I do not shy away from utopianism, thinking this, aiming to go beyond rather than being entrenched in sexuality. It's a utopian gesture. And may probably never get utopian future in anything. But we should move towards there. This is where we find new creative ways to respond to problems and also the urgency and the drive. The negativity stage, the antisocial stage, since the early 2000s with Lee Edelman's book, No Future.
Right.
And Jack Halberstam and his wonderful work on Queer as the Art of Failure, all those forms of negativity, they are different conceptualizations of queer and responding to other things in queer theory. So while Lee Edelman says no future, right, this is where he goes to, there's Munoz on the side of utopia, and I'm totally with him because, I don't know, maybe I'm eventually Marxists at heart. And they are always optimists.
Well, you're among good company here with that. So one thing I want to point out, unfortunately, is that a problem that we have is that our bartender has given us last call that we definitely have no future at this bar for the rest of the night. So I want to thank you, Nir, for joining us. This has been a really excellent conversation, and just encourage listeners to check out his book, A Deleuzian Critique of Queer Thought. You can get it on the Edinburgh University Press website, and I appreciate you taking our questions today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Good night, y'all.
Bye, everybody. Bye.